horrible serial killer, he was a pillar of his community. He was a doting father. He was a loving husband. His neighbors enjoyed spending time with him because he was high energy and he threw great parties. But what people didn't know from outward appearances is that he was schizophrenic and had been diagnosed at a young age. He also had this deep obsession with death and dying that he could never quite shake. His morbid obsession would ultimately take over, and he would go on to end the lives of nearly 24 young men in Indiana. And he would bury the majority of them on his property, which was known as Fox Hollow Farm. When an investigation into all these missing young men in Indiana points at Herb Baumeister being the primary suspect, Baumeister flees his property and ultimately ends his own life. And in the note he leaves, he just says that the reason he's taking his own life is because his business is failing and so is his marriage. He doesn't confess to any of the murders. He doesn't give investigators any indication of how many people he killed or where they are. He didn't give any closure to anyone. He just took his own life, and that was that. And so while investigators did a very thorough search of the property that Baumeister owned, the Fox Hollow Farms property, and found over 5,000 human bone fragments and were able to identify a number of victims, they believe that there are more victims buried at Fox Hollow Farms that we may never uncover. So our story picks up over a decade later when two new owners come in, purchase Fox Hollow Farms, and almost immediately some very strange things start happening in and around the property. Then they record this very famous audio recording inside the property, which that in conjunction with the other strange things that they had seen around the property leads them to believe that Fox Hollow Farms is haunted. So before we get into their story and we listen to that audio recording, if you're interested in strange, dark, and mysterious content like what I'm promising on today's episode, then you've come to the right place, because this is the type of content that I produce 3 to 4 times a week. And so if that interests you, if you would, please gently assassinate the like button and then turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of these uploads every week. So let's dive in. In 2006, Rob, Vicky Graves, and their 2 teenage sons were tired of living the city, fast-paced lifestyle and decided to look for some property in suburban Indiana where they could kind of escape that busy lifestyle. And so when they were looking at real estate in some of the nicer suburbs of Indiana, they found this one property called Fox Hollow Farms that was this huge, sprawling estate, but was selling for some unbelievably cheap price. And so they contact a real estate agent who says, yeah, we'd love to give you a tour of the place. It's up for sale. No one's occupying it right now. It's owned by an investor, but they are looking to sell, obviously. So yeah, let's do a house tour. And so they're open-minded. It seems too good to be true, but they decide, you know what, we'll go take a look. And so they get to this property, and it's beautiful. It is everything they wanted this dream home they're looking for to be. You know, it has an indoor swimming pool. It's got loads of bedrooms and bathrooms. It's like basically a mansion. And as they're walking around the property, Rob is speaking to his wife, Vicky, and they're both kind of going back and forth like, what's wrong with this place? This doesn't make any sense. Rob starts to wonder, wait a second. I think I've heard of this place on TV before. And he's having like an epiphany. And he's like, I think that this could actually be the home of one of the most notorious serial killers in Indiana's history, Herb Baumeister. It's like it just came to him that the name Fox Hollow Farm was something he remembered hearing on TV. And so he stops the real estate agent on their tour and he says, hey, this is a beautiful home, but is this the home of Herb Baumeister? And the real estate agent, almost expecting this to be brought up, was like, yes, that's why it's still in the market. People are unwilling to purchase this home, even though the investor who scooped this up in the 90s following the tragedy that was the Herb Baumeister case, the investor had basically gutted the whole residence and basically removed all the kind of remnants of what it used to look like when Herb Baumeister was living there. Nobody wanted it because, you know, Herb Baumeister had killed nearly 24 young men and buried them on the property, and investigators still were finding pieces of bone on the property, and they didn't really know how many victims there were. And so it was this kind of spooky place to live. And so the real estate agent just said, that's why it's so cheap. The property's beautiful, it's well kept, but no one wants to be here because of the history. The real estate agent says, here, why don't you and your wife just go talk about it? We can leave if you guys aren't comfortable with this. Ultimately, they decide to purchase the property. So a couple weeks later, Rob and Vicky and their 2 teenage sons move into Fox Hollow Farms, and they love it. And especially their 2 teenage sons love swimming in the pool. And they had gotten in the habit of basically running around outside and then tracking in dirt and gravel into the swimming pool. And so one day, Vicky is vacuuming up some of this dirt and gravel that had gotten inside of the area around the pool. And so she's vacuuming up the gravel, and all of a sudden her vacuum cuts out. And in fact, the power cord where the vacuum was attached to had come undone. And so she thinks, oh, I must have, yanked on the cord and pulled it out of the outlet. And so she goes over and she plugs it back in, and she goes back to vacuuming up the gravel that was in the pool. And so as she's doing that, it goes out again, which surprised her because she remembered thinking to herself, like, don't yank on the cord because you just unplugged it. And she turns around, and now the cord from the vacuum and the outlet it was plugged into are separated by about a foot. That it was as if it had been like yanked out pretty hard. And she's thinking to herself, like, did I just yank on it again? Like, am I wrapped on a chair or something? Like, how did I yank it out, and how did it move a foot away from the outlet? And so after she plugs it in, she checks it and kind of yanks on it to make sure it's not falling out on its own. Like, it's not a, kind of weak connection to the port. And it's not. It's in there secure. And she goes back to vacuuming, and she's looking over her shoulder and checking the outlet as she's vacuuming, like wondering, like, what was causing it to pop out of the socket like that? And as she's looking at it, she watches it pop out of the socket again. Except it didn't just fall to the ground. It like jumped out, as if there was a surge of electricity that, popped it out of the socket or something. And she drops the vacuum because it startled her, and she didn't know what to make of it. Rob worked at a car dealership, and one of his employees, Joe, was chronically late. And it got to the point where Rob's like, Joe, what's going on? Like, why are you always late? And Joe said, I live over an hour away, and I can't get here on time. I got to find somewhere, to live that's closer to the dealership. And Rob is like, well, actually, we have an entire apartment attached to our residence at Fox Hollow Farms that no one's staying in. We'd be happy to let you rent that out. It's right down the road. And Joe's like, actually, that sounds pretty great. And so just a couple days later, Rob helps Joe move into the new apartment. And they spend the whole day moving all the boxes and furniture in there. And just in the span of just a few hours, they move everything into Joe's apartment. Rob leaves. Joe is exhausted. It's just he and his dog, Fred. And Joe just decides to crash for the night, and he lays down in the bed and falls asleep. And so that night, he has this dream where he's being chased by someone. He doesn't know what it is, but it causes him to actually act out his dream, like sleepwalk. He jumps up out of his bed and starts running as if he needs to escape the apartment, but he's like kind of half dreaming, and he runs into the door frame, falls to the ground, knocks a glass over, and actually cuts his hands up pretty bad. And so he like comes to, and he's like looking around, and he's like, what was that? So a couple days later, Vicky comes home, and she finds Rob painting the side of the house. And she and Rob stop and are talking about how beautiful it's going to look when the painting's done. And out of the corner of her eye, Vicky sees something in the forest that was on the edge of their property. And it was actually a man standing with a red t-shirt on, just standing like looking at their property. And as she's looking at him, he turns around and he starts walking away farther into the forest. And so she kind of looks, and before she says anything to Rob, the guy has just vanished into the woods. And so she just goes, Rob, I just saw someone standing on our property. He had a red shirt on, and he was right over there. And Rob immediately is like, well, honestly, we moved into a serial killer's house. We should accept that there's going to be people that are just going to want to sneak onto our property to get a look at this building. And so they walk over to where Vicky has seen this guy in red, and they look, and there's no one there. They yell out like, hey, is anybody here? And no one's there. And so even though it was pretty unsettling, Vicky and Rob just decide that I guess this is a reality of living here, is that you're going to have people spying on you a little bit because of the notoriety of the home. So later that night, Joe is in his apartment, and he's doing some dishes, and it's late at night, probably like 10 or 11 o'clock at night, and he hears a knock on the door. And he's literally mid-dishes, his hands are wet, and so he turns off the water and he yells out, hey, just a second, and he starts toweling off his hands. And as he's doing that, the knocking gets louder and more aggressive. And he's like, hey, hold on, I'm just drying my hands off, hold on. And he assumes it's Vicky or Rob. And so he starts walking over, and the knocking is just incessant. And he finally opens the door, and no one's there. It wasn't like the knocking was going on and stopped, and then he went over there and opened it. It was literally like the knocking was happening as he's opening the door, and no one is standing there. He's like immediately on guard. Like, okay, is someone like on the roof, like bending down? Is someone hiding? Like, what's going on? And he kind of pokes his head out, and he's looking around, and he actually steps out onto the front steps there, and he's looking around, and he figured like if someone had knocked, they'd be running away if they're gone already, and he can't hear anything. It's just silent. There's no one there. And then he goes back into his apartment, shuts it, bolts the door shut, and out of the corner of his eye, he spots what looks like a man in his bedroom, basically just walking past the door frame into his bedroom. And it totally startles him. His dog starts growling and looking in the direction of the bedroom. And so he walks over there and looks in his bedroom, and there's nothing there. He flips on all the lights, he looks around, and he's like, what's going on here? Like, it totally scared him. So Joe had only been in this apartment for about 3 weeks, and one of the things he had kind of developed a habit doing was in the evenings he would take his dog Fred for a walk along the driveway that was, well lit, and the driveway was pretty long. It's a big piece of property, and he would take his dog up to the end of the driveway and then walk back. And because of what he's just witnessed with the knocking on the door and what looked like someone in his apartment, he decides he just wants to clear his head and go on a walk with his dog. And he figured he could maybe swing by the main house and see if the lights were on in Rob and Vicky's house, because in some way, maybe if their lights were on, it would indicate that maybe they had been over and had been knocking on his door, and tomorrow he'll find out what it was about. Like, he's searching for a way to rationalize this. And he notices right away that Vicky and Rob's house is totally dark. They're asleep. He doesn't make it very far when his dog stops. The dog starts taking off into the tree line. And before Joe actually takes off after his dog, he looks up, and he breaks out through some of the lighting over the driveway that there is a man in red with a red t-shirt that's at the edge of the forest. And his back is turned, and he's walking into the forest, and as Joe's looking, it looks like the man in red actually disappears. And so the dog is heading straight for this man in red, and so Joe, because it's his dog, he loves his dog, he starts running after the dog. Even though he's absolutely terrified of what's gonna happen here, he couldn't let his dog get harmed. So he chases into the woods, makes it like a few feet into the woods, where he finds his dog that's now not barking and is actually facing back out at Joe, and it's kind of cowering, looking at where Joe is now standing. And Joe kind of begins to turn, and the man in red is standing right next to him, looking directly at Joe. And Joe just panics and starts running out, doesn't stop to do anything. The dog follows Joe, and they run back to Joe's apartment, run upstairs, shut the doors, shut the blinds, lock everything, and they just sit there. For the rest of the night, Joe is literally checking his window and looking outside, because he doesn't know if he just saw that or not, because that person in red had vanished a minute ago. He thought that perhaps he was convincing himself that he saw someone in red because he had just seen like a ghost in his apartment like a few minutes earlier, and he's starting to think that maybe he's just kind of hallucinating all this stuff, or that he's imagining all this stuff. So he wasn't quite prepared to go tell Rob and Vicky or do anything about it. So he just spent the night basically looking out his window and making sure no one was coming into his residence again. And so the next morning, he goes and tells Rob and Vicky what happened the night before. Everything from the knocking on the door to the person that he thought he saw inside of his apartment, to then ultimately the man in red that his dog chased after. As he's telling them about this exchange with the man in red, Vicky is getting pretty emotional. And Vicky is like, I saw a man in red. And she points to the area of their property, and it's the same area that Joe had just been describing where this had all happened. She was like, I saw a man in red right over there. Like, what's going on? So that night, Joe is in his apartment, and Joe is definitely on edge about what had happened the night before. He's increasingly almost listening for noises outside because of how scary the night before was. And he forgoes his walk on the driveway with his dog. I think he's pretty much done doing that after that encounter. And as he's in his apartment, he hears knocking on the door again. And he yells, who is it? Who's at the door? and no answer. But the knocking continues, and it's one of those knockers. It's the actual knocker on the outside of the door that's being hit over and over again. He can see the door actually shaking from how hard this is being banged against the door. And finally, after like poking his head out and seeing no one, he rips the door open, and no one's there. And he looks at the door itself, and the knocker is perpendicular to the ground, like someone's holding it up, but no one's there. And as he's looking at it, it swings down and knocks the door one last time. He slams the door shut, locks it, and he's absolutely petrified. He sees the doorknob on the door start to turn. He can hear the sound of the spring tightening as the doorknob slowly turns all the way over into the open position. The door's locked, but the doorknob's been twisted. And he's looking at the door, and then there's silence after the doorknob's being held in the, call it, open position. And then all of a sudden it bursts open, breaking the lock. No one's outside. And he looks at it and he's absolutely frozen for a second. And then he just runs out of his apartment to see who is doing this. No one's there. When he turns around and looks into his apartment, he sees a man in white, not in red, who is soaked head to toe, screaming and running towards him, who runs out of the apartment past him and vanishes into the air. And so he takes off. Joe, he's not sticking around, grabs his dog, runs to Rob and Vicky's, and he goes in and tells them what happened. Joe, Rob, and Vicky are so scared that now they're not trying to rationalize that this wasn't a ghost, let's say. They're trying to convince themselves that this is a friendly ghost, that these are the victims of Herbert Baumeister that have been tormented by Baumeister, but they're here because they're trapped here. That man you saw in your apartment, that was a victim of Herbert Baumeister, escaping from Herbert Baumeister. The man in red, that was a victim of Herbert Baumeister. We're dealing with the victims here because so many people had their lives snuffed out here. And so it isn't really calming them, but it's like they're creating a narrative that fits what's happening. Because without a story, this is impossible to understand. And so they really start to believe that what they're experiencing is a haunting, but it is of Herb Baumeister's victims basically acting out their final moments or kind of leading them to, what happened to these victims. And so that night, Joe, Rob, and Vicky start going online and researching who the victims were, the known victims of Herb Baumeister. And there's images of all of these different victims. And as they're scrolling through all the pictures, Joe stops them on one and he goes, "That's the guy that was in my apartment. It looks exactly like the guy that was soaking wet, screaming, that ran out of my apartment." Like, that confirms, this is a confirmation to the three of them, that the entity they're experiencing in this property is definitely the victim. So they do feel reassured at this point, scared, but reassured that these are the victims. And so they start really aggressively researching the Baumeister case, and they come to realize that there's actually a number of victims, more than likely, that have not been uncovered, that have been buried on this property, only lending in their mind more credibility to the idea that this is a property that is haunted by the victims of Herb Baumeister. And so after a couple of days where there isn't much activity, Joe decides to go for a walk in the woods in the same area where the man in red had been seen by Vicky and by himself a couple days earlier. And he just decides, in broad daylight, I'm going to go for a walk with my dog out in the woods. And so he starts walking in that direction, and literally sitting on the leaves, like practically on the trail in plain sight, is a human bone. It's a femur bone just sitting on the trail. Like, the idea that bone wouldn't have been located during the extensive search for bones on this property is nearly impossible. To Joe, the way he described it is, I feel like that bone was left there for me to discover it. That the man in red, who was more than likely a victim of Herb Baumeister, had led me to finding that bone. And so they believe, Joe, Rob, and Vicky, that when they send this bone in for forensic analysis, that they'll determine that this was another victim that perhaps hasn't been identified yet. And they're kind of expecting it to be the man in red, whoever that was. And so Rob ends up calling the lead detective from the Baumeister case and says, "Hey, we found a bone." And so they submit that and they take it in as evidence. And Rob asks the lead investigator if he would mind coming to the property and just kind of explaining to them, where things occurred, on the property relative to the Baumeister case? Where did all the tragedy unfold? Like, where were people buried? Just to give us a sense of what we're dealing with here. And so the investigator agrees, and the investigator comes out, and the vast majority of the killings happened in the swimming pool, where Baumeister would basically lure young men to come to his property to go swimming. And as soon as they got in the pool, he would strangle them to death. And the weird thing about the pool area is that Baumeister was, well, a psychopath, and he had put mannequins all over the inside of this swimming pool that had like party outfits on. And so there are these very eerie pictures of the swimming pool with like mannequins all around the outside. And it was basically a place where he lured his victims and ended their lives. A couple days later, Joe is in his apartment, and he's doing some work at his computer, and he hears a metallic scraping sound coming from his kitchen. And so he goes over to his kitchen, and he finds that all of the knives that were in his butcher's block have been pulled out and lined up neatly in the bottom of his sink, like very neatly arranged. And he's looking at it like, I didn't do that. And he turns towards his workstation, like as if to like look around the room, and he notices on the island that sits where he was standing right in front of him, a little bit low down, like halfway up the island, there was all these fresh cut marks in the wood, like a number of cut marks across the wood. And he's looking at that, and he's thinking to himself, is this one of the victims telling me that, perhaps they had been attacked with a knife right here in the kitchen? He's thinking like it's his duty to try to figure out which victim this was and what happened to them. And so he gets his iPhone out, and he turns on the voice recorder, and he starts recording and asking some questions of the room. And he first make sure to turn off the TV, turn off the AC so it's quiet. And so with his recorder, he starts asking, like, who's anybody here? And there's silence. And he's like, who was the person in the kitchen? Who was walking through the kitchen? And there's silence. And then when he asks again about was there anybody in the kitchen, his dog starts growling and reacting to something in the room. And now Joe hasn't heard anything. He's not heard any confirmation that, there's someone in the room. He actually felt quite silly doing it. He takes his phone back to his computer because he takes his dog growling as maybe somehow confirmation that there was something there. And he downloads the audio file, and he listens to it. And as he's listening to the file, right after he asks about is there anybody in the kitchen, he gets a response.
Who keeps walking in the kitchen?
Who's in the kitchen? The married one. And so as Joe is looking through all their files, he's seeing that every single victim was single. No one's married. They're all young men who are single. The only one who was married, involved in this case, was none other than the serial killer himself, Herb Baumeister. And so Joe has had this revelation, and it's when he realizes that it's not just the victims here. Herb Baumeister, the serial killer himself, is haunting this property. So I'd love to hear what you think is going on at Fox Hollow Farm, whether this is a haunting with Herb Baumeister himself showing himself and speaking on audio files, or if this is just a big hoax. I'd love to hear what you think. And if you want to get in touch with me, please direct message me on Instagram. My handle is JohnBallen416. I'm also very active on TikTok. My handle is MrBallen over there as well. And again, if you haven't already, please gently assassinate the like button and turn on all post notifications so you don't miss my 3 to 4 weekly uploads. It's easier to relate to the people involved because they probably lived their lives kind of similar to how you're living now. Different, but similar, right? And also like the information, if you're looking at a case that happened 50 years ago or less, it's easier to fact check that information, and there's probably more information about that case. Whereas if you're looking at something that's happened, let's say hundreds and hundreds of years ago, while certainly there are people involved and being a human being, I can relate to them in that sense, but the way they lived is a lot different than we live now. And so it's very difficult to kind of put myself in their perspective because my experience living on the earth is so much different. And of course, information, even if it was diligently transcribed at the time, it's taken hundreds of years to arrive in front of me now. And so the opportunity for information to change or to be passed down inaccurately or to just be a straight up embellishment is much higher. So the accuracy of information in older cases it's a little bit up for grabs. So I tend to be interested in more recent mysteries. But there is one case, in fact, it is the oldest unsolved mystery in American history that I have been fascinated with ever since I heard about it in grade school. And the reason I'm talking about it now in this video is not only have I found it fascinating, but there has been some recent discoveries, as recent as 2011, that totally changed the theories about what could have happened in this particular case. And the case I'm referencing is the lost colony of Roanoke. The too long didn't read version of the story is when England first tried to colonize America, they set up a colony on Roanoke Island, which is right off the coast of North Carolina. And when it wasn't going very well and the early colonists, they needed more supplies, they sent their leader back to England to get more supplies. But when he came back, the colony was gone. All 115 people gone without a trace. And all that was left were two strange messages. One was on a tree and one was on a fence post right in where the colony used to be. And for centuries, historians and amateur sleuths alike have debated what those messages mean. But a recent discovery in 2011 completely changes people's interpretation of what happened at Roanoke. Before we get started, if you are a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, well, you've come to the right channel because that is literally all I'm going to be doing. And I post 3 to 4 times a week. So if that appeals to you, if you would, please gently assassinate the like button and then turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of these cool stories. All right, let's dive in. By the late 1500s, England wanted to colonize America. And in the early 1580s, an Englishman by the name of Sir Walter Raleigh was basically given a permit to go colonize America. Basically it said, okay, it's 1580 and you have until 1591 to colonize somewhere in America. If you can't do it by then, you're going to lose your permit. He starts getting funding together. He starts, looking on a map to figure out where's a good spot to land. And by 1584, he's ready to launch his first reconnaissance mission to America. So in 1584, 2 ships make their way to North America and they land somewhere in the Outer Banks in North Carolina. They land and they actually quickly befriend the local Native Americans that are there. And in fact, they invite these English people to come to their village, which was on Roanoke Island, also in North Carolina, not too far from the Outer Banks. And so these early English settlers are brought to this village and they're able to coexist with the Native Americans really beautifully. They're sharing trade secrets, they're learning how to hunt, they're learning how to do all the things that you would need if you were going to live in this new land. And again, they're being embraced by the local population, which was huge. So after 1 month of this reconnaissance mission, that group of early settlers is really excited about the possibilities of settling in America. So they make their way back to England and they share their findings with Sir Walter Raleigh, and preparations are immediately began to launch an actual colonization effort into Roanoke. So 1 year after this initial reconnaissance mission, Sir Walter Raleigh is ready to launch this full-fledged effort to colonize America. And so he sends 7 ships with 600 men and supplies that were designed to last that group of people for a full year. And so everything's going beautifully. They're sailing their way over to America. And when they reach the Outer Banks, their flagship, the biggest and best ship they had that was carrying the bulk of their supplies, their food, their fresh water, it ran aground and a lot of their supplies fell into the ocean and were spoiled. And so this is a devastating blow, and they know immediately that, well, not everybody on this fleet can actually land here. So they sent 500 men back to England and only landed 100 of the original 600 in Roanoke. Now, as soon as this second round of settlers, these 100 men, landed in Roanoke, they went and spoke with the local Native Americans. There was already good relationships built from that first reconnaissance mission, and these settlers were given permission by the local natives to build their colony in Roanoke. So they begin constructing their colony, and everything is going off without a hitch. In fact, the Native Americans were incredibly generous. They worked closely with the settlers, and, did their best to support them however they could. Now, the settlers, they still needed more supplies. They didn't have this robust supply that they planned on having because much of it was destroyed in that shipwreck as they initially made their way in. So they had been promised by the 500 returning crew members that they were going to send supplies by the following winter. So they're anticipating this shipment of new supplies, and as they get closer to the winter time, the 100 settlers that are there, they're running incredibly low on supplies to the point where they actually basically run out. And so they had to rely on the local Native Americans' generosity just to stay alive. When the shipment that was supposed to be there in the winter did not show up, and in fact had actually been canceled, they didn't know this, it had been canceled by Queen Elizabeth, who basically said that wasn't important, we're going to focus on things that are happening in England. When that doesn't show up, the tensions between these 100 settlers and the local natives, the tension was growing because now there's a huge overdependency. That tension grew to the point where the leader of the settlers and the leader of the local Native Americans began to not trust each other. And in fact, the local natives, instead of being violent, decided that they would just abandon Roanoke and go to the mainland and would just kind of give Roanoke Island to the settlers, and that would kind of solve all the problems. But the English settlers took their retreat as a sign that they were actually going to the mainland of North Carolina, these Native Americans, and were going to be forming alliances with other tribes, and then they were going to come back out and wipe out the 100 settlers. We don't know if that's true because what happens next is the English settlers, in kind of a fit of paranoia, they preemptively cross the water and they make it to the mainland and they attack the Native Americans that had previously been helping them and keeping them alive, and they actually wiped them out. These English settlers come back to Roanoke Island, and now the paranoia is even higher because now they don't have supplies, they don't know how to live there, they've just basically started a war, and it just so happens that an English-bound fleet was passing by the area on their way back to England, and when they stopped at the colony, the settlers were basically in a panic. I mean, at this point, they've just recently wiped out this Native American tribe. They're freaking out about what's going to happen to them. And they were in such a rush to abandon the colony and evacuate that only 97 of them got on the ships and left. They literally left 3 people there. They said, well, they're not here for the evacuation, so we're out of here. And so sure enough, that fleet took the 97 settlers and they left, leaving those 3 settlers to fend for themselves. As irony would have it, just days after this evacuation, Sir Walter Raleigh, he had sent additional ships with resupplies and reinforcements to Roanoke, and they literally arrived like a couple days after this mass evacuation. But when they arrived, the colony was abandoned and they didn't find those 3 men that were left there. So Sir Walter Raleigh's reinforcements just left. And then a couple weeks later, another English-bound fleet passed by Roanoke and stopped to check in on the colony, and they found it abandoned. And because they had so many people on this fleet that was passing by, they decided to leave 15 crew members at the colony because they felt like this is an English colony. It's not in total disrepair at this point, and perhaps this is going to be useful to the crown, or we can use it in some way. So they leave 15 crew members to basically guard the outpost while they go back to England and figure out what's going to happen next. So it would be months before anybody went back to Roanoke. So those 15 crew members were kind of hung out to dry a little bit. But a man by the name of John White, who had been a part of that initial failed colony in Roanoke, who had evacuated back to England, he was still eager to colonize America. And so he actually convinced Sir Walter Raleigh to launch a new expedition back to America to try to recolonize, not in Roanoke, but slightly north in the Chesapeake Bay, which was just viewed as a more fertile and just more advantageous position. And then in 1587, they send out 3 ships back to America to try this colonization effort all over again. It is important to note that unlike the first effort, which was much more kind of militaristic, it was literally 600 men that got sent to America. This time it was going to be a more kind of civilian approach, where it was men, women, and children being sent over to America to colonize. So with John White as the captain of these 3 ships, they're making their way towards America, and again, their plan was to go north to the Chesapeake Bay area, but they intended to pass by Roanoke on purpose because they knew about those 15 crew members that had been left there, almost a year prior. And so they intended to stop at Roanoke and basically have a meeting with those crew members, give them supplies if they needed it, and then make their way up to the Chesapeake Bay. However, something strange happens where the chief navigator, a man by the name of Simon Fernandez, who had navigated during the initial reconnaissance mission, the very first trip to America, also navigated for the second trip to America when they brought the 600 men, now navigating for this 3rd trip with John White. He had the charisma of a real leader and was frankly just very well respected. He's an incredible sailor. And even though John White was technically the captain, really it was Fernandez that really had the respect of all of the people on this trip to America. And so for some reason, Fernandez decided that he just didn't want them to go up to Chesapeake Bay. And instead, when they got to Roanoke to have this meeting with the 15 crew members, he just basically told everybody to get off. Like, we're not gonna go north. Everybody that's here to colonize, go ahead and get off because we're out of here. And John White didn't put up a fight. I think he recognized that the pull this guy had was gonna be too much. And the crew and everybody who was there just kind of accepted it. And so even though it was a total deviation, they just begin to colonize Roanoke, even though, again, that was never their plan. So as they're literally descending upon Roanoke, they're getting ready to meet with these 15 crew members who they're really hoping are still alive, but there's no sign of them. There's no sign of the crew that were left behind, and all they find is like a little pile of bones. And John White speculated that, perhaps this is a sign that the crew members were, attacked by, the Native Americans that were seeking revenge because they had been wiped out from that initial group that had been here, the initial English settlers. John White's suspicions would actually be proven true when just a few days after the 100-plus group of colonists that kind of began setting up camp in Roanoke, a man by the name of George Howe was away from the colony a little bit, and a group of Native Americans surrounded him and shot him with 16 arrows. So it was kind of like a message to the settlers that, like, you're not welcome here. Your predecessors that wiped out an entire tribe, yeah, we haven't forgotten about that. So you're not allowed to be here. It was not a good start for John White and his new colony. Feeling like the colony was kind of doomed from the start, the colonists actually told John White, hey, if this is the way it's starting, we need more people here, we need more supplies, like this is not a good start. We are not set up for success here. You need to go back to England and get more supplies and bring them back here, because without that, we're doomed. And it just so happened that Fernandez, the guy that had kind of ditched them, he hadn't left the Outer Banks yet. He had anchored at the Outer Banks, and he was basically still available to take people back. And so John White initially was against the idea because he didn't want to be viewed as someone that was kind of abandoning the colony when he got back to England. And John White's daughter, who was pregnant, was there. She was one of the early colonists. She was there in Roanoke, and he didn't want to abandon her. But ultimately, he says, okay, I'll go. And he goes and gets on Fernandez's ship, and they go back to England. Now, unfortunately, when he got back to England, England was in the middle of a war with Spain. And so the Queen had ordered any English ship was basically not allowed to leave England because they needed to be able to defend themselves against the Spanish Armada. And so he wasn't able to leave England to go back to Roanoke, whether he had supplies or not, for 3 years. And so 3 years go by, and he finally, with the help of Sir Walter Raleigh, is able to be put on a convoy of ships that is going back to America with the necessary supplies. And so he heads off. So it's 1590, 3 years since John White has left Roanoke, left his daughter, and to go back for supplies. Now he's back, and he's got the supplies, and they get to the Outer Banks and they get in their small boats to make their little journey up around to the north side of Roanoke so they can actually get on the island and go check out what's happening at Roanoke. And when they land on the north side of Roanoke, they start yelling to try to get anybody's attention. There's no answer. As they walk up into the woods, they notice that there are some fresh footprints right on the beach and then in the woods itself. But again, no one's coming to greet them, which is a bit of a bad omen, because if there are fresh tracks, either it's an English settler, in which case they would be eager to come see them, they'd be running out to meet them, or it's a Native American, which could mean they don't trust the English settlers, right? They don't want to show themselves, or they don't want to be seen, which is also kind of ominous. They start moving in to where the Roanoke colony was, and they see 3 letters on a tree. It just says CRO on a tree as they're making their way into the colony. And again, they're yelling the whole time, trying to get anybody's attention, and no one's calling out. There's no sign of life anywhere. So they see CRO on the tree, and then they keep moving closer, and now they break out the colony. And the colony, when they left, had not been heavily fortified. Now it was very heavily fortified with big pikes, basically like wooden pikes lining the outside of this basically looked like a fort. And on one of the wooden posts that was kind of fortifying the outside of Roanoke was the word Croatoan. There is not only nobody inside of this heavily fortified colony, this kind of fort, if you will, it looked like no one had been there in years. The grass was overgrown, basically anything of value had been looted effectively. The only things that were left were like really heavy objects that would have been difficult to move. But there was also no sign of a struggle. There was not like human remains anywhere. There wasn't a clear sign of struggle. I mean, obviously it's this well-fortified area, which leads you to believe that they were at least anticipating some sort of attack, but there was no sign of a struggle. They're just gone. John White, he would write about this experience when he arrived and just discovered the colonies vanished, 115 people just gone, right? He wasn't actually concerned, because the writing that he saw on the tree and on the wooden post to him meant something really specific. Before he left to go back to England to get the supplies, he had spoken with the people that would be staying there and said, look, if you need to abandon Roanoke for any reason, we need to have a system worked out to where if I come back and you're gone, I need to know what happened. And so you need to leave me a clue. You need to write a clue somewhere of where your destination is. If you're going by choice, just write the destination. If you're being forced, write the destination with a cross. And that will, to me, signify that you've left in distress. And so when he sees Croatoan and crow on the tree, to him that just means, oh, well, they must have relocated to the island of Croatoan, which was 50 miles to the south. He would detail in his notes that before he left Roanoke in 1587 to go get those supplies, he said that the settlers had been talking about leaving Roanoke, abandoning Roanoke, and moving 50 miles north to the mainland, not 50 miles south to an island. The concern was the island was isolated and not a good place to have a colony, and so they were talking about leaving it. And so he just kind of casually mentions in his notes, oh, well, they were thinking about leaving to go 50 miles to the mainland, so that might be why they're at Croatoan Island. But that doesn't really make any sense, because you're just kind of abandoning one problem set for another. Like, you want to leave an island because an island has unique problems. Why would you go to another island? You would go to the mainland. So that was kind of problematic. So John White believes they've just up and relocated to the Croatoan Island. And so he quickly takes his men and he goes back to the ship, and they begin to turn and set their course to go south the 50 miles to the Croatoan Island. But as fate would have it, the anchor line snapped as they're trying to make their way south to the Croatoan Island, and the weather was getting progressively worse and worse, and they start drifting north and north until finally the captain of the crew just said, look, we cannot go to the Croatoan Island. It's not going to be possible. And so they had to return to England. John White never would return to America, so he actually would end up dying with absolutely no idea what happened to the colony. And in fact, no one really knew what happened to the colony. It was just this huge cliffhanger. The assumption is they've gone to the Croatoan island, but no one could prove that they really had. Literally, for centuries, people just speculated as to what could have happened to this colony. I mean, there's the assumption that perhaps they did just go to Croatoan and eventually kind of assimilated with the Native Americans there, and they just became a part of the culture there. There was other theories that they were wiped out at some point by angry Native Americans, but it was all just assumptions until the 1930s, when a small stone was found by a man just out walking around, and he turned it into a museum, and they looked at it, and it was written by Eleanor Dare, who was the daughter of John White, the pregnant daughter that he had abandoned and didn't get to see again. And she detailed what had happened. And half of the colony got wiped out by Native Americans that were angry at them, and then another percentage were taken captive, and then there's a couple survivors that are barely able to survive that don't really expect to live very long. At the time this stone was found, I mean, everybody knew that the last we had heard from the Roanoke colony was that they more than likely had made their way to the Croatoan island, because that was the word written on the post, the CRO on the tree. I mean, that's what made the most sense. And so why would there be this stone by the daughter of John White 50 miles to the north of Roanoke? Wouldn't it make more sense to have been found on either Roanoke itself or at Croatoan? Like, it didn't really add up. And so a lot of people speculated that that stone had to have just been a fake, a hoax. But in 2011, a major discovery is made in the Roanoke case that actually lends a lot of credibility to the stone that Eleanor Dare had apparently written on. John White was a painter by trade, and he had created all these maps of the colony, of Virginia, of North Carolina, of everywhere he went. He basically painted a map. It was customary when you were making a map, if you had small mistakes on your map, you would actually cut a new piece of canvas, and you would put the corrections on that piece, and then you would slap it over wherever your mistakes were made. And so it wasn't uncommon, if you were looking at a map, to see little patches kind of all over the map. And so for literally centuries, there were these maps that John White had created that had a number of these little patches on the map. And in 2011, somebody who was researching said, well, why don't we look under the patches and just confirm that they really were just that, little mistakes that were covered up and corrected with a patch. And it turned out that on one of the maps, there was a patch over a section of land 50 miles to the north of Roanoke, around the area where that stone had been found. And underneath the patch was a star. And the star was set to resemble a fort. So basically there is an English fort built, basically where that stone had been found. But it had been covered over with a patch, as if the fort was a mistake, right? Like, oh, whoops, shouldn't have been a fort there, and they put a patch over it. But upon closer inspection, the patch that had been put over that X on the map that signified a fort right where that stone had been found, well, on the patch, there was literally hidden ink where someone had drawn a similar X to denote a fort, and they'd put that over the obvious fort symbol that they were covering up. One could maybe make the case that they wanted to signify to someone that was maybe looking for invisible ink, they wanted to signify that that was where the fort was, but they didn't want someone who intercepted the map, for example, the Spanish, because they'd just been at war with the Spanish. They did not want them to know where a location of a fort was. Researchers began calling that site where there was that patch, Site X. Now, Site X is 50 miles to the north of Roanoke. And if you recall from what John White had put in his description when he was describing finding the writing on the tree and the post when he returned to Roanoke in 1590, he had referenced that the colony was planning to move 50 miles north to the mainland because that was a more suitable place to live. But of course, with the writing on the trees, everyone thought, oh, well, they ended up going to Croatoan. Well, now as Site X, that is a location that lines up with what they had originally said they were going to do. And you have that stone written by Eleanor Dare at the same location. And so archaeologists descended upon the area that was Site X, and while they haven't confirmed that there's a fort or they haven't found a fort in the area, they have found metal and pottery that is potentially indicative of an English settlement. And in fact, right now, they're still doing all sorts of archaeological digs and research to try to determine if that is where the Roanoke colony went. But even if that is the answer to the mystery, that in fact, it was just this hidden map and this stone that said, yep, they went 50 miles north, it doesn't really answer the question, which is what everybody thinks of when they think of the Roanoke colony, of why was Croatoan written on the fence post? Why was Crow written on